Hello, everyone, and welcome to our channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you've been following this gripping saga, then you know the most breathtaking moment so far. Trelana, betrayed by her own people, confronted her ruthless commander in a life-or-death showdown and emerged victorious. Want to know how she managed to pull off that final, heart-stopping strike against all odds? Be sure to stick around and listen to the whole story to find out every thrilling detail. While you're here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more epic tales just like this one. By subscribing, you won't miss any of our new content. Also, feel free to drop your personal opinions in the comments. Let us know where and how you enjoy listening to these stories best. We rate all your feedback and love hearing from you. Now on to the next parts of this adventure. Trelana lay sprawled across a stretch of churned mud and broken stone, her breath ragged and pained as she stared into the roiling skies overhead. Her once majestic armor, ceremonial plating crafted from the sleek metals of her people, the Zalthar, now lay shattered around her. Deep gashes tore through the metal, and her own dark violet blood matted the seams of her underlayers. Every inhalation shot sparks of agony through her, and she wondered if her next breath might simply be her last. The battlefield, once a place where victory had seemed so close, was littered with bodies of friend and foe alike. Smoke curled from the remains of scorched outposts, collapsed towers, and toppled military vehicles that had once been on the move. She remembered the moment of betrayal as vividly as her own name. Commander Garrick, the veteran leader she had fought under for countless missions, looming above her with a stern expression of disapproval rather than concern. His sharp gaze, flecked with the gold irises characteristic of elite Zalthar officers, had carried an unmistakable message of dismissal. She had struggled to rise, her limbs trembling from the concussion of a nearby mortar strike. The swirling dust that filled the ruined city caught in her throat, making it difficult to speak, yet she had forced out a single plea. Her whispered request for help, whether from the sting of her injuries or desperation, had fallen on the cold hush of Garrick's indifference. Survival of the strongest, he had intoned. No place for the weak among the Zalthar dominion. With those words, he had turned on his heel, his loyal subordinates following without so much as a backward glance. Trelana had watched their silhouettes merge into the smoky haze of war, leaving her bleeding and alone on the fractured ground. Nothing that had happened in her entire life could have prepared her for the sensation of being thrown away, deemed unworthy of rescue by her own comrades. The sting in her chest was as potent as the physical pain tearing through her side. Yet as despair threatened to consume her, Trelana refused to close her eyes in final surrender. She had trained relentlessly under the Dominion. She had been taught that pain was a tool, fear a weakness to be eradicated, and loyalty the bedrock upon which all Zalthar society stood. Garrick's betrayal struck her as the cruelest revelation. Everything she had fought for meant nothing if she was labeled unfit in a moment of perceived vulnerability. She ground her teeth, determined that if she were to, it would not be from simply giving up. Then came the sound, footsteps amidst the carnage. Human reinforcements had presumably arrived to mop up the remnants of the Zalthar invasion force. Trelana's heart pounded. She had heard countless tales of human ruthlessness. She'd witnessed enough battles to know they rarely spared Zalthar warriors. The only question was whether the final bullet or blade would come swiftly. With what remained of her strength, she pushed against the gore-soaked ground, trying to drag herself behind a chunk of concrete. But her vision blurred. Blurred, dizziness threatening to take her under. And then, in a heartbeat, she saw him, a human soldier with broad shoulders and dust-caked battle armor, scanning the rubble for threats. His expression, stern, guarded, was exactly what she'd expect from someone on the front lines of an interspecies war. Yet in the moment his gaze locked onto her, she did not see immediate revulsion or triumph. Instead, there was a flicker of uncertainty. The muzzle of his rifle leveled at her, but the shot never came. When he knelt, a half-spoken question on his lips, Trelana's chaotic thoughts churned. She could only whisper, "End it." Instead, the soldier lifted her gently as darkness swept over her consciousness, leaving her fate in the hands of an enemy's mercy. When Trelana came to, the first sensation was not the expected torment of a field execution, but the dull ache of her wounds. Above her was a makeshift roof of twisted metal beams, partially covered by torn fabric that flapped in the wind. Orange light from a small fire danced across the fractured walls, illuminating a cramped alcove within the ruins of what had once been part of an administrative structure. Her side stung fiercely with each breath, but something had been bound tightly around her middle, preventing her from bleeding out. She felt a tug of disbelief. Someone had bandaged her, presumably the human whose face she recalled in a blurry memory. Cautiously tilting her head to one side, she spotted the soldier sitting a short distance away. The battered armor across his frame bore signs of prolonged conflict: scorched plating, scratched insignias, and a few bullet grooves that indicated near misses. He had removed his helmet, revealing a face that looked as tired and battered as Trelana felt. Lines of dirt and soot traced across his cheeks, and his dark hair was matted with sweat. The rifle lay across his lap, within easy reach should she try anything. Yet he did not immediately point it at her, nor did he appear hostile. Instead, he watched her with a complicated mix of curiosity and concern. She inhaled, flinching as the simple act sent a jolt of pain through her bandaged ribs. Her throat felt like sandpaper. It took effort to rasp out any kind of question. "Why?" she managed, her voice rough as gravel. In her mind, it was the only query that mattered. Why save the life of an enemy? He stayed quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the flickering flames of the small fire back to her. Finally, he spoke. "Name's Damon Hayes, Sergeant of the 27th Alliance Battalion. You were still breathing. Didn't feel right to just leave you." He fiddled with a canteen at his hip, then tossed it toward her with gentle, underhand precision. "You look like you need that more than I do." Trelana eyed the canteen warily. Her people, the Zalthar, had repeatedly told stories of human trickery. Poison water could be one such method. But what reason would he have to poison her now after tending her wounds? The logic, though hazy, made her suspicion momentarily recede. She took a small sip and was relieved to find it was only tepid water, metallic in taste but not laced with anything harmful. A faint sense of gratitude flickered before she smothered it. Gratitude was not something a Dominion warrior was supposed to feel toward an enemy, yet she couldn't hold back a hesitant word of thanks. Taking a deeper gulp, Trelana suppressed a groan, propping herself against a chunk of rubble so she could sit. Her surroundings came into sharper focus, and she realized that nightfall had cast long shadows outside, and the rattle of distant gunfire was muted. Still, the knowledge of ever-present danger weighed on her mind. She was deep in contested territory. If the Zalthar command found her, broken, reliant on a human's pity, they would kill her on sight for weakness. Or they might do worse, dragging her back only to make an example of her. Hayes cleared his throat. "You've got a nasty wound there," he noted, flicking his gaze to her rib bandages. "Took me a while to stop the bleeding. You're lucky the shrapnel didn't puncture a lung." His calm yet concerned tone stirred a cocktail of conflicting emotions in Trelana. Her instincts said no human could be trusted. Her training hammered in that humans were beneath the superior physiology of the Zalthar. But her present situation was a testament to the glaring hypocrisy in those beliefs. Her own people had left her to perish without a second thought. This human had chosen to save her, with no immediate benefit to himself. Silence settled again, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the muffled wind outside. She weighed her next words carefully. 1,000 questions loomed, about his motives, about her own future. But the pressing reality was that, wounded and alone, she had little choice but to accept his precarious generosity. With the Dominion considering her a liability, and with the human alliance presumably not eager to welcome a Zalthar warrior, her path lay shrouded in a haze of uncertainty. Even so, the glimmer of compassion in Hayes's eyes pulled her away from the abyss of despair she had faced just hours earlier. A moment of quiet passed before Trelana felt the gnawing in her stomach force its way to the forefront of her thoughts. She hadn't eaten in what felt like days. Her body screamed for nourishment, but she tried to hide it. Showing weakness, even hunger, to an enemy felt like exposing her throat. Evidently, Hayes heard the muted grumble from her gut. Without comment, he reached into his pack and offered a sealed ration bar. The packaging was crinkled silver, clearly standard human military issue, with blocky text indicating it might be some kind of tasteless protein supplement. She stared at it, once more hesitating. "I've heard humans sometimes lace rations with substances to poison or weaken captives," she said, her tone edged with caution. It felt like a desperate last attempt to cling to the distrust her Dominion training had instilled. He replied with a quiet shrug. You think I'd go through the trouble of dressing your wounds just to poison you now? His voice held no anger, merely a calm logic that resonated more than she wanted to admit. Trelana exhaled, a wave of pain reminding her to tread carefully. She accepted the bar, peeling it open with trembling fingers. The first bite was chalky and nearly flavorless, but it didn't matter. Her hunger drove her to finish it in a few ravenous gulps. When she was done, she felt a small measure of strength seep back into her limbs. Outside, the wind battered the remnants of broken walls. Trelana's hearing, sharper than a human's, picked up faint sounds of distant troop movements. It wouldn't be long before more Zalthar patrols swept the area or human squads came to finish securing pockets of resistance. Neither possibility boded well for two individuals stranded in the midst of the devastation. Even in her pain-diminished state, Trelana's mind worked through the angles. If a Zalthar patrol arrived first, they might assume she had been captured. There would be no rescue. Dominion protocol demanded that any soldier who fell behind and displayed vulnerability was a disgrace. Her superiors would doubtless fire a bullet through her skull or deem her a traitor on sight. On the other hand, if a human squad discovered her, she could be taken as a prisoner of war if they showed unusual clemency, or more likely, summarily executed. Neither scenario offered a glimmer of hope. Hayes, as if reading her thoughts, shifted closer to the entrance of their makeshift shelter. We can't stay here much longer, he said, rubbing a patch of grime off his rifle's receiver. His posture suggested readiness, as though he expected a fight at any moment. The battle lines aren't stable. We've got to move, find somewhere less exposed. The idea of moving in her current condition nearly made Trelana's vision swim. Despite the bandages, every step promised to be a trial in agony. Still, she swallowed her fears and the impulse to tell him she needed more rest. You'd rather risk traveling with me than trying to rejoin your own forces alone? She asked, testing his motives. Hayes frowned slightly, gaze drifting over her battered form. I'm cut off from my squad, and the lines are fluid out there. You're injured, but you've still got your senses. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. He paused, then added with a hint of directness, I don't leave people behind, if I can help it. His words struck a nerve. Trelana recalled the way Garrick had sneered at her, had called her a disgrace, had left her in the muck as an expendable resource. And now here was a human soldier, with no reason to protect her, claiming he refused to abandon anyone. The difference was a blade that cut deep into her old convictions, forcing her to see a reflection of what real loyalty might look like. She clenched her fist, ignoring the raw ache in her side. All right, she said through gritted teeth, forcing herself to sit straight. If we move, we do it carefully. And if we get cornered, I won't be used as a bargaining chip. The last bit was an attempt to reassert some semblance of control, though she suspected Hayes had no such plan. He nodded, meeting her gaze steadily. Deal, he replied. Though they had formed no formal alliance, a fragile bond of necessity had begun to coalesce. A single thread weaving two very different warriors together against a common threat, the uncertain madness of war. Morning light came slow and dim, filtered through clouds heavy with soot and the promise of more rain. Trelana and Hayes stepped gingerly out of their makeshift shelter, scanning the rubble-strewn streets for signs of movement. The burned-out husks of ground vehicles lay toppled in craters, some still smoking faintly. Structures that had once been proud monuments to architectural ingenuity now stood half-collapsed. Twisted beams jutted like broken limbs from the ground, and the occasional hiss of live electrical wires sparked in the distance. Trelana gritted her teeth with each step. Even with Hayes offering the occasional supporting arm, pain radiated through her torso with brutal consistency. She bit back any groan or complaint, knowing how vulnerable they already were. She was Zalthar, after all, trained to be a disciplined warrior in the face of adversity. She would not let him see any further crack in her resolve. Hayes guided her toward what appeared to be a partially intact overpass. Beneath it, the ground was littered with debris, but it provided some cover from aerial surveillance. Trelana noticed his eyes darting regularly to the overcast sky. Perhaps he feared reconnaissance drones or a surprise strike from airborne Zalthar craft. For her part, she was no less anxious. She knew the Zalthar's ruthless efficiency. They would eventually send patrols to call any survivors, ensuring that no rebellious pockets lingered. They found a sliver of relatively intact asphalt and moved in tense silence, broken only by a distant echo of gunfire. Here and there, they skirted around the remains of smaller skirmishes, the bodies of both humans and Zalthar, their final expressions frozen in terror or grim resolve. Trelana resisted the urge to look too long, though part of her felt she owed them at least a moment of recognition. Once she would have been proud to fall in battle among her own people, but that was before she realized her value to them was merely conditional. Up ahead, Hayes murmured, gesturing with a subtle point of his rifle. Trelana followed his line of sight to see a pair of Zalthar soldiers in partial reconnaissance gear, scanning the rubble with handheld devices. They appeared to be searching for functioning equipment, or stragglers like Trelana. Hunkering down behind a chunk of collapsed concrete, Trelana tensed. She recognized the sleek lines of their armor, the glowing emblems that marked them as advanced scouts. They had come far too quickly if they were only searching for salvage. More likely, they were here to ensure that no one from the Dominion side remained unaccounted for, particularly those deemed unworthy like Trelana. The logic was chilling. Better to tidy up the battlefield, eliminate the wounded, destroy sensitive tech, and maintain the Dominion's pristine image of unstoppable might. Hayes glanced at her, his voice barely above a breath. We can try to slip around them, or... She knew what he implied. They were both prepared to fight if they had to. Trelana's heart hammered. She still felt a sting of betrayal, a swirl of fury when she thought of Garrick walking away and labeling her weak. These scouts, for all she knew, had the same mindset. They'd kill her or drag her back in chains. And they'd kill Hayes for sure. A sense of calm purpose settled over her. She lifted a battered sidearm that Hayes had lent her. I may be injured, but I'm not helpless. Let's handle this quickly. She caught a spark of something like approval in Hayes' gaze. It happened fast. The two scouts were methodically checking the remains of a toppled vehicle when Trelana emerged, her weapon raised. She fired before either scout could react fully, the shot catching the first in the shoulder. The second pivoted, rifle whining with a high-pitched energy charge. Hayes' shot found that soldier's chest in the blink of an eye. Both Zalthar dropped amidst scattering rubble, their gear clattering around them. They didn't scream, didn't beg, just a final gasp of breath. Trelana forced herself to stay cold, to remember that they would have done the same to her. This was war, after all. In the hush that followed, she exhaled a shaky breath, the dull throb in her torso intensifying. Hayes scanned the area to make sure they hadn't drawn attention. Then the two pressed on, each step drawing them deeper into the labyrinth of destruction. By midday, they had found temporary refuge in what used to be a government center, a colossus of stone and steel that now lay broken in half, as though a giant had smashed it from above. Trelana and Hayes slipped through a gap in the foundation, discovering a corridor that had partially remained intact. Collapsed walls turned the hallway into a cramped, tunnel-like space, but it was defensible. If any patrol tried to enter, at least Trelana and Hayes wouldn't be caught off guard. A musty smell permeated the corridor. Stale air, old electronics, and the faint coppery tang of dried blood. The flicker of half-dead overhead lights cast erratic shadows, enough for them to see but insufficient to feel comfortable. The environment resembled a scene from a nightmare, but at least it was free from the howling winds and watchful drones outside. Setting down his rifle for a moment, Hayes carefully pulled a small med kit from his satchel. He gestured for Trelana to sit, then checked the bandage around her torso. She stiffened at the vulnerability, letting him peel back the cloth to reveal a wound that still oozed sluggishly despite partial cauterization. Some infection might be setting in, he muttered, rummaging in the kit for antiseptics. This'll hurt. Trelana braced herself. She was no stranger to pain, but each cleansing swipe of the solution felt like 1,000 needles piercing her flesh. Her sharp claws gouged at the concrete floor in an effort to maintain composure. Her breath caught in her throat, and she refused to cry out, but tears of pain misted her vision. You're doing fine, Hayes murmured, applying a fresh bandage. She wondered when she had last heard such comforting words from anyone, let alone an enemy soldier. Once the immediate medical concerns were addressed, Hayes sank against the wall, letting out a weary exhale. Trelana could see the exhaustion etched in his features, the result of endless hours or days of fighting and survival. She felt an unexpected pang of empathy. For all his kindness, he was still a soldier in a brutal conflict, trying to keep his own life intact. She realized with a jolt that they were, in many respects, alike. Two fighters cast adrift in a war that cared little for individuals. Amid the oppressive silence, she decided to speak. "I don't understand your reasons," she said, eyes scanning the damaged corridor. "You risk so much to help me. We are enemies, or we were." He gave a quiet half-smile, though weariness dulled its warmth. "I had my fair share of prejudice when I first went into this war," he admitted. "We all did. But after you've seen enough carnage, you start to question everything. Who's us? Who's them? And what it all means. You were left for dead, just like some of my squad mates were left behind by poor leadership. That kind of betrayal. I don't care if you're Zalthar or human, it shouldn't happen." Something in his tone reminded Trelana of the devotion she had once felt toward Commander Garrick and the Dominion cause. She had believed that the Zalthar way was supreme, that a chain of command based on survival of the strongest would forge an unbreakable empire. She swallowed hard, her instincts warring with the fresh perspective blossoming under Hayes's small acts of humanity. "Your people won't accept me," she ventured, brow furrowed, "and mine have already decided I'm a lost cause." Hayes shrugged, drawing his knees closer. "Then it's just us right now." A subtle confidence underscored his words, like a man who had decided to carve his own path when the official routes led nowhere. Trelana felt her chest tighten. Perhaps it was the knowledge that, for once, someone was fighting for her rather than with her. Perhaps it was the unsettling realization that in a time when everything else was crumbling, she might need him more than she could admit. Either way, a fragile bond of trust began to build, piece by unlikely piece, in the fractured halls of a ruined civilization. They waited until dusk to move again. The corridors leading through the government center were labyrinthine, strewn with collapsed floors that opened into dim chasms and offices half gone, their contents lost to the flames. Every so often, Trelana caught sight of old Dominion propaganda posters beneath the rubble. Though these were human city ruins, Zalthar infiltration teams must have set up some measure of occupation before the final push. The slogans in her own language reminded her of the commanding presence the Dominion once boasted in many star systems. Strength above all, only the worthy prevail. She paused before one particularly large half-burned poster. The face of a Zalthar general scowled out from the tattered paper, urging recruits to dedicate themselves fully to the cause. As she stared at it, she was ambushed by conflicting memories. The pride she had felt during her earliest training sessions, the unwavering camaraderie she once believed thrived in the Dominion ranks, and the heartbreak of being discarded when she most needed help. Hayes noticed her lingering. "Bad memories?" he asked quietly. She inhaled, trying to ignore the pang in her side. "Memories of a time when I thought everything made sense," she replied. "When I believed we were forging a galaxy of order and might." He tipped his head slightly, empathy glinting in his gaze. "I've seen a lot of recruits, both human and alien, start out with big ideals. War has a way of twisting them." Her next question came unbidden. "What about your leaders, your commanding officers? They never abandoned you?" She couldn't hide the slight tremor in her voice. A kernel of envy, perhaps. Hayes's expression tightened with a mix of sadness and reflection. "Not everyone in the Alliance is perfect. I've had COs who made questionable calls that got people killed. But I've also served under leaders who do anything to save their troops. The difference is that we don't believe the wounded that are burdens to be thrown away, or at least we try not to." His words cut deep. The Dominion's official stance was that only the fit should propagate the species. That weakness of any kind was a liability. She realized that somewhere along the way, the original code of protecting one another had warped into an ethos that demanded discarding those who couldn't keep up. Garrick's heartless act was not an anomaly, it was the system working as intended. They resumed moving, weaving through hallways illuminated by flickering emergency lights. At times, they had to crawl over piles of rubble, and each strain on Trelana's core muscles threatened to draw blood from her healing wound. More than once, Hayes paused to check on her, and more than once, she shoved aside his concern with a grunt, determined not to appear fragile. Eventually, they emerged into what must have been a large atrium, now open to the night sky. Broken glass and twisted girders loomed overhead like giant skeletal arms. The stench of decaying flesh wafted through, revealing bodies sprawled across the floor, some half buried in debris. Trelana stepped forward, heart pounding, until she noticed a familiar set of markings on one of the corpses, an officer's insignia from the Dominion. A tremor coursed through her as she knelt by the body, turning it just enough to see the face. It wasn't Garrick. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But the officer was from the same battalion that had marched under Garrick's command. This soldier had fought beside her in earlier conflicts, no more than a cycle ago. Trelana remembered small kindnesses, a shared meal, a moment of camaraderie. In the Dominion, friendships were fleeting, overshadowed by competition for rank. Yet she had at least considered him an ally. Now he lay cold and lifeless, eyes glazed in perpetual shock. It was a reminder that so many warriors who had once believed in the Dominion's cause had perished here, and that Trelana herself would be dead too, if not for the human at her side. Did that make her disloyal, or was it a sign that the Dominion had never truly deserved her devotion? Hayes hovered near, offering silent support rather than forced sympathy. She rose slowly, anger mingling with sorrow. "It doesn't matter who we used to be in this war," she said, voice shaking. "We're all either forgotten or left behind in the end." Hayes nodded once. "Not if we can help it," he answered in a tone that suggested the fight wasn't over for either of them. The final confrontation that would shape Trelana's destiny came with little warning. Near the far end of the atrium, the faint glow of flashlights and scuttling movement became evident. Trelana stiffened as she recognized the distinctive hum of a Dominion hovercraft. Commander Garrick, she could sense his presence like a thundercloud on the horizon. She signaled Hayes to crouch behind a collapsed marble pillar, both of them peering over the edge. The hovercraft's side panel bore the same battalion insignia Trelana had once worn proudly, a stylized wing symbol representing the Dominion's claim to superior might. Her heart beat with a mixture of dread and simmering fury. A handful of armed Zalthar stepped down from the craft, scanning the environment with practiced thoroughness. Trelana's pulse quickened as Garrick himself emerged, wearing a stern look that radiated disgust at the ruins around him. His golden eyes surveyed the scene, seemingly bored with the devastation. "Search the perimeter for survivors," Garrick ordered, his voice echoing in the cavernous atrium. "Eliminate any wounded. Salvage what you can. The Dominion does not leave its mess behind." Trelana's mouth went dry. Here he was, the very officer who had decided her life meant less than the cost of bandages. She recalled every painful second of her betrayal. His dismissive scoff, his turning away, the final blow to her pride as he had effectively ended her existence within the Dominion. Rage welled up, forcing her to clamp down on her trembling muscles. Hayes leaned closer, whispering, "We should move. They outnumber us, and your wound." But Trelana couldn't. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to confront Garrick. It was more than personal vengeance. It was a chance to stand against the merciless ethos that shaped the Dominion's cruelty. She looked at Hayes, her eyes burning with conviction. "I'm not leaving until I face him." The possibility of an actual fight with Garrick's elite guards seemed suicidal. Yet as Trelana rose from her crouch, she felt a strength that had eluded her since being cast aside. The Dominion had branded her weak, unfit to live among them. She intended to prove them wrong. Wrong, even if it cost her everything. She emerged from behind the pillar, heart racing. Garrick's soldiers jolted to attention, weapons raised, their faces contorting with confusion and alarm at the sight of a wounded comrade they presumed dead. Garrick turned slowly, his gaze settling on Trelana with open surprise. His lip curled back. "You still breathe?" he asked, his tone thick with condescension. "I thought I made it clear that only the strong—" Trelana cut him off with a cry of fury, leveling her sidearm. But before she could pull the trigger, one of the Dominion soldiers opened fire. She dove behind a chunk of marble, pain searing her side as bullets pinged and ricocheted off stone. Hayes, emerging from the shadows, returned fire with disciplined bursts from his rifle, forcing the Zalthar soldiers to scatter. In the frenetic exchange of gunfire, the atrium exploded with flashes of light and the crack of ricochets. Garrick hissed orders to his subordinates, urging them to press the advantage. Trelana drew in ragged breaths, her wound throbbing so fiercely she nearly blacked out. But the fury kept her conscious. She thought of the ones who had died believing in a code that ultimately threw them away. She thought of her own near death, saved by a human of all people. Then an opening appeared. One of Garrick's soldiers went down under Hayes' covering fire, leaving Garrick momentarily exposed. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Trelana lunged from cover, pivoting on her good leg to deliver a shot at close range. Garrick twisted, narrowly avoiding the bullet. His hand lashed out, smacking Trelana's weapon aside. She felt the shock of the blow reverberate through her battered body. "Traitor!" Garrick spat, eyes blazing with contempt. Trelana gritted her teeth. "I was loyal until you threw me away." They grappled, her smaller frame dwarfed by the towering, heavily armored commander. But she fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. Garrick struck at her side, drawing blood, but she refused to fold. Their dance of mortal conflict illuminated the entire reason Trelana had survived: to break free from the Dominion's brutal oppression. As Trelana and Garrick circled each other, the air thick with tension, Hayes kept the Dominion guards at bay with controlled bursts from his rifle. Despite being outnumbered, he maintained a vantage point behind a ragged column, skillfully channeling their attention away from Trelana's personal duel. The floor near his position was littered with empty magazines and spent shell casings, each one a testament to his unwavering resolve not to abandon her. Garrick lunged again, swinging a sharp-edged baton that cracked the air with formidable speed. Trelana barely managed to dodge, twisting her body so that the baton glanced across the ruined plating of her armor rather than landing a direct hit. Pain still jolted her side, but her adrenaline refused to let her buckle. In a split-second countermove, she drove her elbow toward Garrick's visor, forcing him to stumble back. "You should have died on that field," he growled, voice reverberating with the fury of someone who believed in the Dominion's merciless doctrine. "You had no place among us." Panting, Trelana steadied herself. "Then this fight is my answer to your Dominion code." She readied her sidearm again, but Garrick stepped in close, grappling her wrist. The muzzle of the weapon wavered, neither of them able to get a clean shot. In the swirl of chaotic fighting around them, Hayes took out another Dominion soldier who had rushed forward with a blade. Now only one guard remained to hold the perimeter while Garrick faced Trelana. The ring of spent cartridges, smoke, and scattered debris felt like its own enclosed arena. Trelana's limbs threatened to give out, but she clung to her anger, letting it ignite the last vestiges of her strength. She pinned Garrick's arm, trying to wrestle free. With a guttural snarl, he bashed his helmet against her forehead, stars exploding behind Trelana's eyes. Blood trickled down her temple, but her grip didn't loosen. She was done with being the victim. In that haze of partial disorientation, she managed to twist the sidearm, pressing it against a chink in Garrick's torso armor. A deafening shot rang out. Garrick froze, eyes widening in disbelief. Then his body slumped, sliding off Trelana's outstretched arm. She staggered back, half collapsing as her vision swam. A final echo of the gunshot reverberated across the shattered atrium, as if the very ruins themselves gasped at the turning of fate. For a breathless moment, neither side moved. The last Dominion guard appeared torn between charging in fury and retreating in horror. Hayes, stepping past fallen rubble, aimed squarely at the guard's head. The soldier knew his commander lay dead at Trelana's feet. With a hardened scowl, the guard threw one final glare of loathing at the battered Zalthar who had defied everything. Then, in a flash, he bolted for the hovercraft, taking off into the smoke-filled night. Trelana sank to one knee, pressing a hand to her throbbing forehead. Garrick's lifeless eyes stared blankly at the atrium ceiling, the Dominion insignia on his armor now splattered with blood. Hayes rushed over, quickly surveying the damage. "We need to get you out of here," he said, voice urgent and low. She stared at Garrick's body, numbness creeping into her limbs. This was the man who had thrown her away, who had represented everything she once admired about Dominion might. Now he was gone, and with him, any illusions she'd held about returning to the life she once knew. She had sealed her fate. Hayes looped an arm around her, helping her remain upright. She swallowed, trying to speak, but words failed her. The conflict that had raged for days, perhaps even months within her, was laid bare in the final moment. She felt neither triumph nor unworthiness, only a stunned clarity. At last, she forced out a whisper. "It's finished." Hayes's eyes flicked to Garrick's corpse. "Yeah," he said softly. Then he supported her weight as they limped away from the place that had become a tomb for a Dominion commander and a graveyard for Trelana's old identity. Emerging from the atrium, Trelana's steps felt heavier than before, despite the internal sense of finality. With Garrick dead, she was truly severed from her old world. The Dominion's officers, if they learned of her involvement, would mark her as a traitor fit for execution on sight. That might have been a death sentence, if not for the battered, loyal presence of Damon Hayes beside her. They pushed through more rubble-strewn corridors, searching for a viable exit point. Twilight cast the remains of the city in an otherworldly glow, turning jagged towers of debris into looming silhouettes. Every so often, the rumble of distant artillery reminded them the broader battle wasn't over. Pockets of conflict still flared, but Trelana felt an odd sense of liberation. She had taken vengeance, faced down the embodiment of Dominion cruelty, and survived. Hayes paused at a vantage point formed by a collapsed wall, scanning the cityscape with a monocular device. The mild whir of focusing lenses filled the silence. "I see movement near the western outskirts," he murmured, quickly adjusting the focus. "Might be Alliance troops, but too far to confirm." Trelana leaned against a cracked pillar, breathing unevenly. Blood loss, exhaustion, and the whirlwind of emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She was intimately aware that she wouldn't last much longer without proper medical attention. Human or Zolthar, it didn't matter. Anyone in her condition risked infection, organ failure, or worse. Hayes picked up on her weakness, his gaze flicking back to her. "We'll head that way, see if we can link up with a friendly unit," he said gently. "They might help, or we might have to do some explaining, but you need real care." She let out a short, bitter laugh, pressing a hand against her bandaged torso. "They'll see me as the enemy," she said, though her tone lacked certainty. "And I doubt I can wave a white flag and say I had a change of heart." Hayes hesitated, looking down at the rough floor. "I won't lie, it could be complicated, but I owe you for saving my life back there too. While I kept those guards busy, you took out Garrick, something I might not have managed on my own. I'll vouch for you, whatever it takes." His words warmed a part of Trelana she had long since believed frozen. A Zolthar and a human, standing together in the ruins of a war neither had chosen to be part of. In her old Dominion worldview, such a scene would be considered impossible or grotesque. Yet she couldn't help the flicker of relief that someone was willing to stand by her side after everything. "You're not afraid you'll be labeled a traitor too?" she asked, genuinely curious. Hayes released a breath. "If it comes to that, I'll face it. I've seen enough blind hatred and rigid protocols that fail soldiers. We do what we can to stand for something better, or at least to keep each other alive." That quiet conviction resonated with Trelana more than she cared to admit. For all her training and the Zolthar's emphasis on dominance, she had never been taught compassion as a form of strength. Garrick's betrayal had nearly broken her, but perhaps this unexpected alliance was showing her another way. Leaning away from this pillar, she forced herself to stand straighter. "Then let's go," she said, voice steeled despite the tremor in her limbs. "I don't have much left, but I'll follow you." In the final stretch of the night, Trelana and Hayes picked their way through rubble-strewn streets, broken rooftops, and the twisted skeletons of abandoned vehicles. The city seemed haunted by its own demise, each collapsed building a silent testament to what had once been. Eventually, they reached a set of half-destroyed barricades that might have served as a forward human base weeks ago. The tension in the air was palpable. Even with her night vision dulled by fatigue, Trelana spotted subtle glints, gun barrels or scopes positioned in vantage points. Hayes raised a hand in a gesture of non-threat, his rifle slung across his back. He called out a challenge phrase, a standard Alliance identification code. After a taut moment, a response came, and several shapes emerged from behind a partially collapsed bunker. "Sergeant Hayes," one of them asked, a female soldier, her voice tinged with the shock of seeing a ghost. Hayes offered a tired salute. "Long story," he said, nodding at Trelana. "She's with me." Their approach was tense. Trelana felt every eye drilling into her. She sensed how her tall, lithe form, reflective eyes, and battered Zolthar armor triggered protective instincts in these human soldiers. Whispers passed among them. Hands hovered near triggers. She swallowed her pride, keeping her own posture as peaceful as she could, though pain threatened to topple her. "You're sure about this, Sergeant?" the female soldier pressed, her gaze flicking between Trelana and Hayes. "Absolutely," Hayes replied in a tone that brooked no challenge. She's no threat. Need medical attention. ASAP. An uneasy murmur rippled through the small group, but one man ran off to fetch a medic who appeared with a kit and a worried frown. Trelana braced herself as the medic approached, uncertain if she'd be treated or quarantined. Yet as the medic began undoing her bandages, Trelana realized that the Alliance soldiers, though wary, were not automatically cruel or dismissive like Garrick had been. Their suspicion might be intense, but it was overshadowed by the practicality of aiding someone in dire need. During the patch-up, Trelana's mind whirled. She had left everything she knew behind on that battlefield. Garrick's murder had severed her from the Dominion, but it also freed her in a way. Still, she bore the scars of that life, and the path ahead with the Alliance looked uncertain. Could she ever truly belong here, or would she be relegated to the fringe, tolerated for her battlefield utility, but never fully trusted? Hayes knelt beside her, wordlessly offering a canteen again. She took a slow sip, meeting his gaze. In it, she found a reflection of her own turmoil, and also a promise that she wasn't alone in this precarious journey. Whatever acceptance she found here would not come easily, but she realized she wanted to earn it. She wanted to prove, to herself and perhaps to the cosmos, that no code of brutal abandonment could define her worth. The sky lightened from pitch black to a dusky purple. Through the scorched skyline, the first rays of a new dawn crept in, lighting the paths of jagged destruction and half-hidden sorrow. Trelana inhaled sharply as a fresh bandage pressed against her wound. In that breath, she sensed a future unraveling before her, one where she could redefine who she was and what she stood for, far from the suffocating demands of the Dominion. She turned to Hayes, who watched her with a quiet steadiness. "Thank you," she said at last, the simplest, truest words she could muster. His expression softened. "We'll figure it out, Trelana," he replied. "War's not over, but you and me, we're still alive. That has to mean something." And so they stood on the brink of uncertainty, an unlikely pair bound by survival, and a promise that neither would be left behind again. In a galaxy torn by conflict, their steps toward the coming dawn marked more than just escape. It marked the start of a shared fate shaped by mercy, resilience, and the quiet hope that perhaps, across the chasm between species, empathy could yet triumph.